Yes, we'll talk more about Alfred Hitchcock next week. But you might say I'm tired out. In fact, I'm just dead. Welcome back for some more Halloween fun here on Betamax Blocker. If you watched my videos from last Halloween, we did some reviews of different horror and sci-fi films from various decades on VHS, and we also talked about classic horror double features and classic horror multi-packs from the 30s and 40s. And I thought today, let's take a look at some more multi-packs, but this time we'll go with newer films, mostly from the 50s and 60s. There are some exceptions here. Please comment your favorites or ones you like below, and we'll talk about some more great choices for Halloween. Since we've been on the subject of Hitchcock for the past couple videos, kind of makes sense to talk about one of Hitchcock's biggest imitators, that being none other than William Castle. Castle did a lot of low-budget films, many of which are rip-offs of Hitchcock stuff, not all of which, and some go in very interesting or creative directions. Here we have 13 Ghosts, 13 Frightened Girls, which is much more of an espionage film, but it does have horror elements to it. Mr. Sardonicus, one of his most famous. Homicidal, perhaps his most famous. And The Old Dark House. Now I should add that these are all films that Castle didn't just produce, but also directed. Some films like Rosemary's Baby, he was involved in the production aspect, and we'll talk about Rosemary's Baby next week. But so he directed all of these, and some of them actually have quite interesting touches. Mr. Sardonicus is well remembered for the makeup applied to Guy Rolfe, the permanent smile makeup there, which is quite good for the time. And Homicidal was based on Psycho, but kind of took it in a different direction and has a lot more plot to it, but it's still a very compelling watch. The Old Dark House is a reworking of the 1930s horror comedy, but that one's much better. This one's a little too loopy. And 13 Ghosts is kind of a gimmicky family horror comedy kind of job, and not a big favorite of mine either. But Castle did make some compelling stuff, and this is kind of the budget edition collection of his films, and I highly recommend that. So last fall, and again in this video, I'm going to kind of mix horror and sci-fi together, because oftentimes they do go together. You know, there's quite a bit of overlap, including my t-shirt today, The Invisible Man, that overlaps horror and sci-fi. So let's take a look at two collections of work from the 1950s, predominantly Sci-Fi Ultimate Collection. So here's the first of the two volumes. Some of these films you'll surely recognize. Tarantula, probably best known today for having a young Clint Eastwood in it. The Mole People, that made it to Mystery Science Theater. One that actually has a pretty substantial following today is the 1957 The Incredible Shrinking Man, which even got a Criterion Collection release. A very good film, and one that has aged quite well, too, and it's been remade and parodied and so on many times over. A very underrated one is The Monolith Monsters, I believe also from 1957. The Monolith Monsters being rocks from outer space that when exposed to water grow to massive proportions and are in danger of flattening entire cities and whatnot. Very simple premise done well. And finally, Monster on the Campus. This one actually reminds me of the movie Trog with Joan Crawford. A little bit different though. A serum can turn people into like prehistoric Neanderthal sort of individuals through some kind of weird scientific magic there. And it's dumb and it's over the top, but the actors commit, and the troglodyte man makeup is actually pretty darn good. So a lot of fun ones on here, and if you like Mystery Science Theater fodder, of course you'll probably remember the Mole People and whatnot, but some silliness combined with some seriousness makes for a fun set. And of course we know the rule, if one thing is successful there's got to be a follow-up. Here is the sequel to that, the classic Sci-Fi Ultimate Collection, Volume 2. Dr. Cyclops, the first film here, is actually from 1940, and this is my favorite movie between the two volumes here. Dr. Cyclops with Albert Decker as the eponymous doctor, one of the first color science fiction films. And Dr. Cyclops, of course, has his radium-based shrink ray and shrinks a group of people and then attempts to kill them and whatnot, and it pits them against him in a battle of wits and wiliness. Pretty good stuff. Cult of the Cobra is kind of a Cat People ripoff from the 1950s. Very, faux ancient Egypt kind of stuff. I don't remember it being very good. The Land Unknown is kind of a cheapo dinosaur film. Jock Mahoney from some Three Stooges shorts pops up there. The Deadly Mantis and the Leech Woman both made it to Mystery Science Theater. They're interesting enough to watch by themselves. The Deadly Mantis has a lot of stock footage, but the concept of a giant praying mantis attacking Washington, D.C. is pretty interesting. And the Leech Woman is actually one of those kind of eternal life sort of things, elixir of life, but you have to kill to get it. And it's an interesting and compelling story, and definitely a trashy B-movie as well, but it does its job. So, you know, horror and sci-fi are often married together, and these films sort of exemplify that. They are all amusing watches, some better than others, but, you know, if you're looking for a quick hour 20-minute film, that's a good way to go. Keeping on the subject, but moving more into kaiju territory, here's the Sci-Fi Creature Classics. See at the bottom, we have 20 Million Miles to Earth. Ray Harryhausen made the monster, the Ymir. That is easily the best film in this set here, and it still holds up quite well. I'm surprised the Ymir never really became kind of like a classic monster, you know, a kaiju kind of creature. Surprises me, because it's really good here, attacking Rome there, and growing and can't stop. The Giant Claw. Now we have to talk a little bit about the Giant Claw, because it is truly a unique experience. There's nothing I can say that other reviewers haven't said. Dark Corner's review, you know, whatnot, has a couple videos on it. The giant, sort of mangy-looking eagle puppet attacking various cities and looking as unconvincing as possible, but yet it has a huge cult following because it's just such a bad film and so poorly made. And you may notice that the monster is nowhere to be seen on the box or on the disc, because if you haven't seen it yet, you know, don't spoil it, watch the movie, and yeah, the reveal will make it worth your time. But The Giant Claw, very fun movie to watch, one of those so bad it's good kind of things. It came from beneath the sea. We got a giant killer octopus ripping apart the Golden Gate Bridge. A fun film, pretty basic in the grand scheme of things, and one Japanese film with Mothra. Oddly enough, I'm kind of glad they went with Mothra and picked one that maybe, well recognizable, isn't some, you know, it's not like a Godzilla tie-in or something like that people would clamor to get this for. I'm glad they went a little bit different. Mothra's a pretty good film. I always liked it. So, 20 Million Miles to Earth, still my favorite one here. But again, you know, kaiju monsters, giant monster, that kind of thing. Horror elements tied in with some sci-fi. You might remember last fall I reviewed the TCM Greatest Classic Horror Pack. It had Freaks and the 1941 version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Here we have their sci-fi pack, or one of their sci-fi packs, and you might recognize the top two, them and The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. They need no introduction. Instant 1950s monster classics, I would say. Both still very effective today. The sound design in them can be a little grating, but for the most part it definitely delivers on suspense and horror. And The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, hey, if it wasn't for that, we probably wouldn't have Godzilla. So there you go. World Without End and Satellite in the Sky are much more cerebral. World Without End never impressed me. It's a little too, I think, pretentious for what it's trying to do there, and I wasn't a big fan of that. Satellite in the Sky just came off as kind of dull. You know, compared to the top two, the bottom two don't have a lot to offer, and I haven't watched either of them in a long time, but maybe I will this year to kind of refresh my memory on them. But I don't recall either of them being especially compelling films. Now, you can definitely do cerebral science fiction very well. Something like Colossus, The Forbin Project is a terrific film, but there aren't a lot of like action scenes, but it's just very compelling. These two were way too talky and way too full of themselves, I think, to be effective. And lastly, you know, we spent last fall talking about Bela Lugosi as Dracula, went through the Universal monsters and so on. Next to Mr. Lugosi, gotta talk some about our man Count Dooku, or Francisco Scaramanga, or Saruman, aka Christopher Lee, whatever you want to call him, because of course he is probably the most iconic Dracula, next to Bela Lugosi. So we have here this 4-pack of Hammer Dracula movies. The most famous, kind of the original 1958's Horror of Dracula, also known as just Dracula in some places. Very interesting film. Love that it's in color. Christopher Lee is great in it. Dracula has risen from the grave. Taste the blood of Dracula. That one I remember that his appearance is kind of an afterthought. I think it's Ralph Bates who drinks his blood and turns into him or something weird. It feels like it was rewritten halfway through. Maybe it was. And Dracula 1972. Dracula in modern day, which I don't really remember, but I don't recall it being very good. But, this set's worth having just for the original Horror of Dracula. And Christopher Lee is excellent in the part. He was good in anything, really. Even when he was playing Fu Manchu in some of those crappy movies like The Castle of Fu Manchu and whatnot. The movie's awful, but he's doing his best to keep it afloat. And it's good to see him here. And he's always good in a part that requires him to be menacing and classy at the same time. His Dracula doesn't usually have much in terms of dialogue. He mostly growls and hisses and stuff, but he's such a commanding presence that it works, and I think he's actually quite good in it. So Hammer's biggest sort of cash cow was him as Dracula, but I like that they also spent time on non-Dracula horror films. Now, some of these are related to Dracula, but here's the Hammer horror collection there. You can see several different titles at the bottom. I'll actually open it up. We'll go through a little bit more. Some of these I really enjoyed. Others I don't remember too well, or too compelling there, but you can see we got Brides of Dracula. We got The Curse of the Werewolf with Oliver Reed. That's a pretty good one. The Phantom of the Opera, my favorite version, along with the silent one with Lon Chaney. And at the bottom, Paranoid. Paranoid and some of its contemporaries like Scream of Fear were trying to capitalize on Hitchcock films, to take Hitchcock and then kind of, make the movies more streamlined, a little less, of big budget affairs. But I don't recall Paranoid or Nightmare, which is also in this set, being really all that compelling. They seem, they tend to fall into that trap that Homicidal did a little bit, where there's so much plot and so much just convolution that it doesn't really resolve anything. My favorite in this set is definitely Night Creatures with Peter Cushing. And it's a kind of a period horror piece, also kind of like a fake horror piece too. The monsters aren't real monsters, but it works in this context. It doesn't feel too much like a cop-out. So we get one Frankenstein movie, one Dracula tie-in. All told, does its job. So these are horror and sci-fi films, predominantly from the 40s, 50s, and 60s. There are some exceptions to that, but for the most part, that's when they're from. And many of them have aged quite well and are still very enjoyable today. Please join us next week. We'll take a look-see at some Criterion horror releases, and that will wrap up our Halloween. We'll be back to the Beach Boys beginning in November. Hope to see you then. Watch out for ghosts.